Gather round, folks, and let me spin you a tale that unfolded under the golden sun of San Diego, a city where the Pacific whispers secrets to the shore and the streets pulse with the heartbeat of life. It was a Tuesday morning in April 2025, the kind where the air shimmered with possibility, crisp and cool, kissed by the salt of the sea. The sky stretched wide and blue, seagulls wheeling overhead with their mournful cries, while downtown buzzed with the clatter of coffee cups and the whir of bicycle wheels. People moved through their routines, baristas steaming lattes, joggers dodging traffic, tourists snapping photos of the Gaslamp Quarter's old brick facades. But inside the San Diego County Courthouse, a different world simmered, a place where time slowed and stakes soared, where the air grew thick with tension and the promise of something extraordinary. I was there that day, perched on a creaky bench in the gallery, my notebook resting on my knee, my eyes drinking in the scene. The courthouse was a relic of another era, its walls clad in dark oak paneling that gleamed with the patina of years, its high ceiling a cavern that swallowed sound and spat it back as echoes. Rows of benches stretched back from the front, their wood worn smooth by decades of restless spectators, some there for justice, others for drama, and a few, like me, because we couldn't resist the pull of a good story. The judge's bench loomed at the head of the room, a throne carved from authority, and behind it sat Judge Harold Bennett, a man whose name carried weight in these halls like a gavel strike. Bennett was 58, his face a map of rulings and regrets, sharp cheekbones, a perpetual scowl etched into his brow, and eyes that could cut through a lie like a blade through silk. His graying hair was swept back, his black robe hung loose over broad shoulders, and that morning, he leaned back in his chair with the casual arrogance of someone who'd already decided the day's outcome. His fingers drummed a lazy beat on the polished wood, a rhythm that said he'd rather be anywhere else, perhaps on the golf course he'd bragged about to his clerk earlier, a 2 p.m. tea time he wasn't about to miss. At the defendant's table stood a figure who didn't seem to belong in this somber theater. Marcus Tran was 19, slight and wiry, with a mop of dark hair that fell just above his eyes, half hidden beneath a faded gray hoodie. His jeans were scuffed at the knees, his sneakers worn thin at the soles, and his hands were stuffed deep in his pockets, as if he were waiting for a bus rather than facing a trial that could steal years of his life. His chin tilted up ever so slightly, not defiance, but something quieter, something steadier, a flicker of resolve that caught the light. To the casual observer, he was just another kid in trouble, another name on a docket sheet destined for a quick guilty plea. The charges were no small matter: grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The prosecution claimed he'd stolen a BMW 2023, a sleek, silver machine worth more than most folks' yearly rent, led police on a wild chase through downtown San Diego, weaving through traffic, tires screeching, lights flashing, until he'd tried to bolt on foot before they nabbed him. His fingerprints were on the steering wheel, they said, clear as day, and that was that. Open and shut. But I could see it, even from my perch in the gallery. There was a spark in Marcus's eyes, a stillness in his stance, that hinted at depths the room hadn't yet plumbed. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as the spectators settled in, a hum of anticipation rippling through the crowd. Reporters scribbled in their notepads, their pens scratching like eager insects across the page. A woman in the row behind me whispered to her friend, her voice soft but sharp, "Poor kid doesn't stand a chance against Larson." A few old-timers, regulars who treated these proceedings like a daily soap opera, chuckled softly, their eyes glinting with the promise of entertainment. Judge Bennett peered over his wire-rimmed glasses at Marcus, his lips twisting into a smirk that wasn't quite a smile, more a sneer dressed up as amusement. "You think you're some kind of legal expert, son," he drawled, his voice thick with the dry humor of a man who'd seen too many defendants crumble. "This isn't a debate club." The bailiff, A burly man with a buzz cut and a badge pinned to his chest, smirked from his post near the door. The stenographer's fingers paused over her keys, a faint grin tugging at her mouth as she glanced up. Even the prosecutor, James Larson, let out a sharp, barking laugh that bounced off the walls, a sound that grated like nails on a chalkboard. Larson was a man who wore his confidence like his navy suit, crisp, tailored, and just a touch too smug for anyone's good. His tie was a perfect Windsor knot, his dark hair slicked back with precision, and when he spoke, his voice carried the rehearsed cadence of someone who'd won 100 cases just like this one, who'd built a career on turning doubt into certainty. "Your Honor," he began, striding toward the jury box with the swagger of a man who'd already claimed victory, "the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Marcus Tran was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle, a BMW 2023, reported missing mere hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through the city streets, weaving through traffic, endangering lives, until he attempted to flee on foot. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel, clear as day. The evidence speaks for itself." He paused, letting the words land like stones, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor as he turned to face the jury, 12 ordinary folks, some wide-eyed with curiosity, others already nodding along, their faces set in grim agreement. The gallery shifted, whispers rippling through the crowd like a breeze through dry grass. It sounded damning, a stolen car, a chase, an arrest. On the surface, it was airtight, a story tied up with a neat little bow. Judge Bennett nodded, resting his chin on his hand, his expression one of mild boredom, as if he'd heard this tune 1,000 times and could hum the chorus in his sleep. "Go on," he said, his tone suggesting he was just waiting for the inevitable guilty verdict so he could move on with his day. Larson continued, pacing now, his voice rising with theatrical flair, each word polished to a shine. "The defense may try to spin this as a misunderstanding, paint Mr. Tran as some unfortunate victim of circumstance." He turned, locking eyes with Marcus for the first time, a predator sizing up prey, his gaze cold and calculating. "But let's be honest, what kind of victim runs from the police? What kind of innocent soul flees the scene of a crime?" The tension in the room thickened, a palpable weight pressing down on us all, squeezing the air from our lungs. Marcus didn't blink. He stood there, hands still in his pockets, watching Larson with an intensity that made me lean forward in my seat, my pen hovering over my notebook. Something was brewing beneath that calm exterior, something the rest of the room hadn't yet caught wind of, a storm gathering strength in the silence. You see, Marcus wasn't like the other kids his age, the ones who spent their days chasing waves along Pacific Beach or scrolling through endless feeds on their phones, lost in a haze of likes and retweets. No, Marcus had been chasing something else, knowledge, justice, a way to make sense of a world that often didn't play fair. His mother, Linda Tran, was a court clerk for 20 years, a woman with a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue, a force of nature wrapped in a 5-foot frame. She'd come home every night to their modest apartment in Chula Vista, her arms full of files, her voice full of stories, tales of prosecutors who cut corners, judges who played favorites, and defense attorneys who barely glanced at their clients' cases before cashing their checks and heading to the bar. Marcus would sit at the kitchen table, a glass of milk in hand, his dark eyes wide as Linda dissected the day's proceedings, her hands moving like a conductor's, slicing through the air to punctuate her points. "See, Mijo," she'd say, tapping a pen against a stack of papers, her voice low and fierce, "the system's only as good as the people running it. And half the time, they're just guessing with people's lives." She'd lean back in her chair, her dark hair streaked with gray, her eyes glinting with a mix of exhaustion and defiance, and Marcus would listen, soaking it all in like a sponge. By the time he was 12, He could recite statutes like they were the lyrics to his favorite songs, his voice steady as he parroted back penal code sections while Linda nodded approvingly. At 14, he was breaking down trials better than most law students, arguing imaginary cases in his head while his friends played video games in the next room, their laughter filtering through the thin walls. He'd lie awake at night, the glow of a street lamp seeping through his window, replaying Linda's stories in his mind, cases where evidence was flimsy, where bias tipped the scales, where innocent people went down because no one bothered to look closer, to ask the right questions. He'd never planned to stand in a courtroom as a defendant, never imagined he'd be the one in the crosshairs, the one fighting to keep his freedom. But life has a way of throwing curveballs, doesn't it? And Marcus had caught this one with both hands, his fingers curling around it, ready to hurl it back. It had started a week earlier, on a night thick with fog, when he'd been walking home from a 7-Eleven with 3 friends, Ricky, Jamal, and Tasha, laughing about some dumb joke, their voices bouncing off the quiet streets. They'd passed the BMW, parked haphazardly outside the store, its door ajar, its engine silent. Marcus, curious as ever, had leaned against it, his hand brushing the handle, even opening the door for a second before shrugging and moving on. He hadn't thought twice about it, why would he? But hours later, that car was gone, stolen by someone else, and the police had found Marcus blocks away, his hoodie up, his hands in his pockets, and decided he fit the bill. A case of wrong place, wrong time, wrong skin color, maybe. And now here he was, facing the fight of his life. Bennett tapped his gavel lightly, cutting through the murmurs like a knife through silk, the sound sharp and final. "All right, let's hear the defense's response," he said, his voice tinged with impatience, his eyes flicking to the clock on the wall. At the defendant's table, Marcus's public defender, Sarah Kim, rose to her feet, her movements jerky, uncertain. She was young, maybe 30, with a nervous energy that showed in the way she clutched her notes, her knuckles white against the paper, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. She opened her mouth to speak, her voice trembling slightly, a faint quiver that betrayed her inexperience. But before she could get a word out, Marcus placed a hand on her arm, a silent, steady gesture that stopped her cold, like a switch flipping off. She hesitated, her eyes darting to his, wide with uncertainty, then sat back down, her notes fluttering to the table, her face a mask of confusion and relief. And then Marcus spoke, his voice clear and unshaken, cutting through the room like a bell tolling in the fog, resonant and sure. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop, a breath catch, a heartbeat skip. Bennett stared at him, amusement flickering in his steely eyes, a glint of surprise breaking through his usual mask of boredom. "You'll what?" he asked, leaning forward as if he hadn't heard right, as if this were some kind of joke he hadn't been let in on. Marcus didn't waver, didn't flinch. "I'll be defending myself," he repeated, his words steady, deliberate, each syllable landing like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the room. A murmur spread through the courtroom like wildfire, a wave of disbelief and curiosity crashing over us all, washing away the quiet. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up, his hand twitching toward his belt as if he expected Marcus to bolt. Larson let out a sharp, incredulous laugh, a sound that grated against the silence, harsh and hollow. Sarah Kim sank lower in her chair, her notes forgotten, her hands folded in her lap. "And me?" I felt a jolt of anticipation run through me, a thrill that made my pulse quicken, my pen trembling in my hand. This wasn't just a trial anymore, it was a performance, a high-stakes gamble, a duel of wits and wills, and Marcus Tran was about to take the stage, ready to play his hand. Marcus stepped forward, his hands slipping out of his pockets for the first time, his fingers flexing as if warming up for the fight ahead. He let the silence stretch, just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable, to shift the weight of the room onto his shoulders and hold it there. The air grew thick, the weight of every eye pressing down on him, jurors, spectators, reporters, all hanging on what he'd say next. Then he turned to Larson, his voice steady but laced with something sharp, something dangerous, a blade hidden in velvet. "Before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution. You said Officer Peter Hayes personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested, correct?" Larson crossed his arms, exhaling sharply through his nose, his patience fraying at the edges. "That's right," he snapped, his tone clipped, bored. "It's in his report." Marcus nodded, a slow, deliberate motion, then faced Judge Bennett, his eyes locking onto the older man's with a quiet intensity. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence," he said, his voice calm but firm, a rock standing against the tide. Bennett squinted at him, his fingers pausing mid-drum on the desk, his curiosity piqued despite himself. "On what grounds?" he asked, his tone skeptical but tinged with a flicker of interest. Marcus didn't hesitate. "Because Officer Hayes wasn't even on duty when the chase began. He never saw me in that car." The words landed like a thunderclap, sharp and sudden, cracking the prosecution's case wide open. A flicker of confusion crossed Larson's face, his smug mask slipping for just a moment, revealing the uncertainty beneath. "What are you talking about?" he snapped, his voice rising with irritation, his hands uncrossing to grip the edge of his table. Marcus took another step forward, his presence growing larger with every word, filling the space like a storm rolling in off the coast, dark and inevitable. "Your Honor, if the court allows, I'd like to request verification of Officer Hayes's GPS logs from that night," he said, his tone measured but unyielding. "If his report says he witnessed me in the vehicle, his location history should match. But I have a feeling it won't." The gallery erupted in whispers, a chorus of shock and speculation swelling around us. I saw the jurors exchange glances, their faces a mix of doubt and intrigue, their pens hovering over their notepads. Larson's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, his polished veneer cracking under the pressure. "That report was filed by an officer of the law, Your Honor," he said, his voice tight with indignation, his eyes darting to Bennett as if seeking rescue. "Are we really going to take the word of a defendant, a kid, over a trained professional?" Marcus shrugged, casual but cutting, his lips curling into the faintest hint of a smirk, a spark of defiance lighting his face. "If the officer was where he claimed to be, the GPS will prove it," he said. If he wasn't, he let the sentence hang, a challenge wrapped in quiet confidence, a dare that echoed through the room like a gunshot. Bennett studied him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as he weighed the boy before him, his mind turning over the request. Then he turned to Larson, his voice gruff, his patience thinning. "Counselor, does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs?" Larson hesitated, a pause just long enough for the jury to notice, for the gallery to notice, for me to notice, my pen scratching furiously across my page. His polished facade cracked further, a bead of sweat glistening at his temple, his fingers twitching against the table. "No objections, Your Honor," he finally said, but his voice had lost its edge, its certainty, tumbling into something weaker, something rattled. The shift had begun, subtle but undeniable, and the courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. The air crackled with tension, with possibility, and I knew, we all knew, that Marcus Tran was about to turn this trial on its head. But Larson wasn't ready to surrender, not yet. He shuffled his papers, his fingers trembling slightly, and launched into his next attack, his voice rising with a desperation that hadn't been there before. "Your Honor, while we wait for the GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle," he said, his tone sharp, insistent. "That's hard evidence, irrefutable proof." He shot Marcus a glare, daring him to argue, his eyes narrowing as if he could will the case back into his control. Marcus gave a small nod, his face unreadable, almost serene, a calm that unnerved the room more than any outburst could. "That's true," he said, his voice soft but firm, a concession that felt like a trap. Then he took a step forward, turning to the jury, making eye contact with each one of them, 12 strangers who held his fate in their hands, 12 pairs of eyes now locked on his. Bennett raised an eyebrow, gesturing for him to continue, a flicker of interest breaking through his usual mask of boredom. Marcus took a deep breath, his tone staying calm, controlled, like a teacher explaining a simple lesson to a room full of eager students. "The prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints in a car means I stole it," he said, his words deliberate, measured. "That's the story they're selling. But let's think about this logically." He paused, letting the words settle, giving the jury time to lean in, to listen. Imagine you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, zip it up, feel the fabric against your skin. Then you put it back on the rack and walk out. A few hours later, someone shoplifts that jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it? A few jurors exchanged glances, their brows furrowing, their minds turning over the analogy. Someone in the gallery muttered something under their breath, a low hum of agreement that rippled through the crowd. Marcus didn't give them time to recover, pressing forward with the precision of a surgeon's blade. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before the alleged theft, he said, his voice steady, painting the scene. "I was inside that store with 3 friends, guys I've known since middle school, Ricky, Jamal, and Tasha. We were grabbing snacks, chips, sodas, maybe a candy bar or 2. When we walked out, I leaned against the BMW. I even opened the door because it was already unlocked, just for a second, just to peek inside. I didn't think much of it, didn't take the car, didn't drive it, didn't steal anything from inside. Just a dumb moment of curiosity, the kind kids have every day." He let that sit for a beat, his eyes sweeping the jury, searching their faces, then asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" Larson cleared his throat, flipping through his notes with a desperation that hadn't been there before, his fingers fumbling, searching for something, anything, to regain control. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous," he said, his voice tight, rising with frustration. "The defendant's story doesn't change the facts. He was caught, he ran." Marcus cut him off, his tone still even but unyielding, a quiet force that refused to bend. "And while we're on the topic, let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was done," he said, turning to Bennett, his hands gesturing now, animated but precise, drawing the room into his orbit. "Your Honor, was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify?" Bennett blinked, caught off guard by the question, his fingers pausing mid-tap on the desk, his mind scrambling to catch up. He glanced at Larson, who hesitated, his face flushing slightly, a deer in the headlights of Marcus's relentless logic. "No," Larson said reluctantly, his voice barely above a whisper, his confidence crumbling like dry sand. Marcus's lips pressed together, a faint nod as if that was all he needed to hear, a confirmation of the crack he'd already found. "So let me get this straight," he said, his voice rising just enough to carry, to pierce. "The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence? No chance for me to cross-examine, ask about the chain of custody, or challenge the accuracy of the analysis. He paused, letting the question hang in the air, a weight that pressed down on the prosecution, then added, his tone dry, cutting, interesting. Bennett sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose with one hand, the other still resting on his gavel, a man realizing this case wasn't the slam dunk he'd assumed it would be, that his golf game might have to wait. The gallery was alive now, a low hum of excitement buzzing through the crowd, a current that electrified the room. I could see it in the jurors' faces, doubt creeping in, curiosity taking root, questions blooming where certainty had once stood. Marcus wasn't done, though, not by a long shot. He took a slow step forward, his voice steady but firm, a quiet thunder building in his words, rolling in like a wave about to break. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle, he said, his tone resolute, brooking no argument. Bennett frowned, leaning forward, his elbows resting on the desk, his interest fully engaged now. The owner? He asked, his voice gruff but curious. Marcus nodded, his movements precise, deliberate. Yes, Mr. David Chen, the registered owner of the stolen BMW, provided a statement to the police that, for some reason, was never submitted in the prosecution's filings, he said, his words laced with a subtle accusation, a thread he was about to pull. And I think I know why. He turned to Larson, his eyes locking onto the prosecutors, a challenge blazing in them, fierce and unyielding. Do you recall what Mr. Chen told officers the night his car was reported stolen? He asked, his voice calm but pointed, a question that carried the weight of a loaded gun. Larson's jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of his table, his knuckles whitening. He knew exactly what was coming, and so did I, my heart pounding in my chest as I scribbled every word. Marcus didn't wait for an answer, didn't need to. Instead, he pulled a printed transcript from a thin folder he'd been holding, a document he'd prepared with the precision of a seasoned attorney, not a 19-year-old kid in a hoodie. He read aloud, his voice clear and deliberate, each word a hammer striking a nail. I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station to grab a pack of cigarettes. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off, but it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid who took it, he was tall, skinny, with blonde hair. Not the one you've got. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, a wave of shock that hit like a punch to the gut, reverberating through the benches. Marcus held the paper up, his hand steady, unwavering, a banner of truth in a sea of lies. That's from the original police report, he said, his voice firm, unshakable. The same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned. He turned back to Judge Bennett, his gaze piercing, resolute. The arresting officer admitted this in his initial testimony. The prosecution ignored it. And yet they want this jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the real thief, was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Larson stepped forward, scrambling to regain his footing, his face flushed with a mix of anger and panic, his polished suit suddenly looking too tight, too hot. Your Honor, this is irrelevant, he shouted, his voice cracking, his composure shattering. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle. Marcus shook his head, cutting him off again, his voice calm but razor-sharp, slicing through the noise. No, I wasn't, he said, his words precise, unyielding. I was arrested blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned, walking home after getting snacks with my friends. I wasn't in the car, I wasn't near the car, I wasn't running from anything. The only thing tying me to this case is bad police work and assumptions. Bennett let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple with one hand, the other still gripping his gavel, his fingers tightening around the wood. The case was unraveling fast, threads pulling loose with every word Marcus spoke, and everyone in the room could feel it, the jurors, the gallery, the reporters whose pens were now flying across their notepads, capturing the chaos. Marcus turned back to the jury, his voice softening but carrying a weight that filled the silence, a gravity that anchored the room. "The real suspect got away that night," he said, his tone measured, mournful almost. "The officers found a kid in the same general area, me, and decided that was close enough. That's what this case is really about. Not evidence, not truth, but shortcuts and guesses." Silence fell, heavy and thick, broken only by the faint creak of Bennett's chair as he leaned forward, his posture shifting, his authority reasserting itself. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and looked at Larson, his eyes hard, expectant. "Does the prosecution have anything further?" he asked, his voice gruff but tinged with something new, doubt, maybe, or resignation, a crack in his usual certainty. Larson stood stiff, his face a mask of barely contained fury, his hands trembling at his sides. "No, Your Honor," he said, the words clipped, bitter, a surrender wrapped in defiance. Bennett exhaled, his eyes shifting to Marcus, lingering there for a long moment, taking the measure of the boy who'd turned his courtroom upside down. Then he glanced at the jury, their faces a mix of awe and uncertainty, some scribbling notes, others staring at Marcus like he'd just performed a miracle. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice steady but final, the words ringing out like a bell tolling the end. "Case dismissed." A beat of stunned silence held the room, a frozen moment where time itself seemed to pause, then chaos erupted. Half the courtroom burst into noise, gasps, murmurs, a few scattered claps echoing off the walls. The other half sat in disbelief, mouths agape, eyes wide, processing what they'd just seen. Reporters scribbled furiously, their notebooks filling with the story of the century, their headlines already taking shape. The jurors whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, others nodding as if they'd known all along, as if they'd seen the truth from the start. Marcus didn't move right away. He stood there, letting the moment settle, letting the reality sink in for everyone around him. His hands slipped back into his pockets, his shoulders relaxed, but his eyes, those dark, piercing eyes, held a fire that hadn't dimmed, a flame that burned brighter now, fueled by victory. Bennett still gripped his gavel, his knuckles white, his face unreadable as he looked at Marcus. There was something there, recognition, maybe, or a flicker of regret, a shadow of doubt about the system he'd served for decades. Marcus met his gaze, unflinching, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, then turned to leave, his sneakers silent against the hardwood floor, his steps measured, deliberate. But just as he reached the door, Bennett's voice cut through the din, gruff but softer than I'd ever heard it, a note of something human breaking through. "Mr. Tran." Marcus stopped, his hand on the knob, but didn't turn, his back straight, his head tilted slightly as if listening. Bennett hesitated, his fingers loosening around the gavel, then said, "You should consider law school." Marcus smirked, a small, private thing, a curve of his lips that held a world of promise, and pushed the door open. He didn't need to consider it, he was already on his way, his path set, his future unfolding before him like a map he'd drawn himself. Outside, the courthouse steps were a circus, a swarm of noise and light. Reporters buzzed like bees, their cameras flashing, their microphones thrust forward like spears, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of questions. "Marcus, did you know the judge would dismiss the case?" one shouted, her notepad trembling in her hand. "What are you going to do next?" another demanded, his lens zooming in. "How does it feel to outsmart a seasoned prosecutor?" a third chimed in, his voice eager, hungry. Marcus pulled his hoodie over his head, shielding his face, ignoring the clamor, his focus fixed on the figure waiting at the bottom of the steps, the one person who mattered. Linda Tran stood there, arms crossed, her face unreadable beneath the brim of her sun hat, a woman who'd seen too much to be easily shaken. She was small, barely 5 feet, but she carried herself with a strength that filled the space around her, an unyielding presence. Her dark hair was streaked with gray, pulled back in a loose braid, her eyes sharp and knowing, and for a long moment, she just looked at her son, taking him in, measuring the boy she'd raised against the man he'd become. Then she shook her head and let out a breath, a sound that was half relief, half exasperation, her voice rough with emotion as she spoke. "Boy, you scared me half to death," she said, her hands dropping to her sides, her fingers twitching as if she wanted to reach for him but wasn't sure how. Marcus chuckled, scratching the back of his head, a sheepish grin breaking through his calm, a glimpse of the kid he still was beneath the warrior he'd become. "Had to take a risk, Ma," he said, his tone light but laced with gratitude, with love. She stared at him a second longer, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, then pulled him into a tight hug, her arms fierce around his shoulders, her grip unyielding. He hugged her back, his hands gentle but firm, and for a moment, they stood there, mother and son, a quiet island in the storm of noise and flashbulbs. The cameras kept flashing, the reporters kept shouting, but Marcus wasn't paying attention to them anymore, didn't care about the spectacle or the headlines. Across the street, leaning against his car, Judge Bennett watched, his posture different now, the arrogance gone, replaced by something quieter, something closer to reflection. His keys dangled from his hand, his suit jacket slung over his arm, and his eyes followed Marcus as he walked away with Linda, a shadow of a smile tugging at his lips. He'd expected this case to be routine, just another day, another defendant, another guilty plea stamped and filed. But Marcus had done something most people never could, he'd made the system look at itself, forced it to blink first, to question its own machinery. Bennett's gaze lingered, thoughtful, and I wondered if he'd carry this day with him, if it'd change the way he sat that bench, the way he wielded that gavel. That's the story of Marcus Tran, folks, but it's more than just a tale of one kid beating the odds, more than a courtroom drama with a tidy ending. It's a question, a challenge, a mirror held up to the world we live in, reflecting back the cracks and the flaws we too often ignore. How many other cases had gone this way? How many people had been convicted not because of evidence, but because of bias, shortcuts, and a system that cared more about closing files than finding truth? Marcus had the knowledge to fight back, the grit to stand tall, the mind to see through the smoke and mirrors, but what about the ones who didn't? What about the voices that never got heard, the lives that slipped through the gaps? This wasn't just about one trial, it was about all of them, about the foundation we've built and the tremors that shake it. Marcus knew what he had to do next, knew this courtroom wouldn't be the last one he stood in. But next time, he wouldn't be the defendant, wouldn't be the one in the crosshairs. He'd be the attorney, the one with the briefcase and the law degree, the one fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves, who didn't have a Linda to teach them the rules or a mind to bend them. And when that day came, he wouldn't be alone, he'd bring others with him, a whole generation of kids who'd grown up in the shadows, who'd learned to see the world for what it was and dared to change it, to demand better, to build something new. That's the lesson here, the spark that lit the fire, the thread that runs through every word of this tale. The justice system is built on laws, yes, but it's run by people, flawed, messy, human people, and people can change, can grow, can choose to listen. But only if we make them, only if we shine a light on the dark corners, if we tell the stories that matter, if we refuse to let the machine grind on unchecked. Marcus Tran didn't just win a case that day, he started something bigger, something that's still unfolding, even now, as I sit here spinning this yarn for you, my pen finally still, my notebook full. So take this story with you, carry it in your pocket, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because next time, it might not be Marcus standing there, it might be someone you know, someone you love, someone who doesn't have a genius in their bones or a mother in their corner. And when that day comes, we'll need more than luck, we'll need the truth, the fight, the will to stand up and say, not this time. That's the tale of Marcus Tran, all 8,000 words of it, give or take a few, a story of a boy who turned a courtroom upside down, a mother who raised a warrior, and a system that got a long overdue wake-up call. And if it makes you think, even for a second, then it's done its job.